Hello and thanks for joining us from our studios in Israel. Coming up in today's newscast, the Israeli Prime Minister sets off a firestorm in Mexico. Jewish people around the world react to Donald Trump's refugee ban, and this may sound paranormal, but an Israeli psychic gets some major recognition from the CIA. I'm Natasha Kirchuk here with the latest news in Israel. It looks like the Israeli Prime Minister may want to think twice before taking to social media after this weekend's diplomatic fray. Netanyahu praised U.S. President Donald Trump's plan to build a wall on the southern U.S.-Mexico border on Twitter yesterday, sparking outrage in the Mexican government. Trump first pulled Israel into the spat by saying all you have to do is ask Israel for apparent proof that such walls offer protection. Netanyahu tweeted a response that President Trump is right because the wall he built along Israel's southern border has been a great success in stopping all illegal immigration. Mexico was immediately outraged and released a statement expressing its profound astonishment, rejection, and disappointment over Netanyahu's message, saying that Mexico is a friend of Israel and should be treated as such. The statement also reminded Israel that its foreign minister displayed deep affection for the Jewish state during Holocaust Remembrance Day commemorations on Friday.
Recordar el Holocausto hoy es más relevante que nunca ante el muy preocupante resurgimiento en el mundo entero de sentimientos racistas, de nacionalismos malentendidos que hoy nuevamente colocan a la humanidad en una retórica, en una muy peligrosa retórica del nosotros contra ellos, del establecer una visión de diferencias en lugar de afinidades, de pasar por encima de los principios de igualdad, de equidad entre todos los seres humanos, para dar nuevamente, abrir la peligrosa, la inquietante puerta del racismo y la discriminación.
With just an 140-character message, Netanyahu has also managed to ruffle the feathers of the Mexican Jewish community, which fears a rise in antisemitism as a result of the tweet and has already issued a letter condemning the Israeli leader's statement. Several prominent Mexicans of Jewish origin have even sharply criticized him on Twitter, and now the Prime Minister's office is backtracking on the tweet. The Israeli Foreign Ministry has just issued a statement stressing that Netanyahu wasn't trying to voice an opinion on U.S.-Mexican relations. Israel's ambassador to Mexico has even sent out a tweet in Spanish emphasizing that the Israeli-Sinai border was closed for defense against terrorism. But the scuffle goes to show just how much impact a few words can have. U.S. President Donald Trump's planned border wall was announced on Thursday, and the American leader claims Mexico will foot the bill. Joining us now in the studio is the former ambassador to Mexico, Yossi Livne, to give us his input on the U.S.-Mexico-Israel drama. Thanks so much for coming in, Ambassador.
Thank you for having me.
So let's begin with a big question on everybody's mind. Was it a wise move for Netanyahu to show his support for Trump's plans to build this wall?
I think the issue that concerns us is to what degree are there any similarities between the situation on the Mexican-U.S. border versus the southern border of Israel? And there's none. There's no similarity. The issue that we faced over the last, 10, 15 years was a question of people coming in, but specifically the threat of terrorism. We all know what's happening in the Sinai with Daesh and the Egyptians trying to come to terms or to fight and vanquish those terrorist groups in the Sinai. And there are all kinds of elements that go into play there. It's a different situation over the Mexican-U.S. border. And I don't think that by making statements, we were helping anyone. I think that we should stay away. We should not be involved in something that really has nothing to do with us.
Now, what types of effects could this tweet have on the Mexican Jewish community? Because we're hearing reports of people fearing backlash and increasing anti-Semitism as a result of this tweet. And even comments we're seeing in newspapers that are anti-Semitic towards the Jewish community because of this tweet.
Look, the Jewish community, of course, would have loved if no such statement was made, because they find themselves in a very difficult situation. And I looked up at least one newspaper in Mexico in which I saw that the official position of the Jewish community is to open a distance, is to distance themselves from that statement. I don't know that it will bring, an outbreak of anti-Semitic events. Yes, there are newspapers in Mexico that tend to be radical in their coverage of Israeli affairs and would take some really despicable positions and descriptions. On the whole, I don't think that it will bring open anti-Semitism. Is there
could we see an effect on? Well, yeah, that's a good question.
Yeah,
too.
but is there anti-Semitism in Mexico? Probably no more than in other places. And but again, it is something that puts people in a very difficult situation, something they certainly did not want to be in.
Which I think leads to a much broader question. Having served as the Israeli ambassador to several different countries, El Salvador, New Zealand, also Mexico, what kind of an effect have you seen the words of former prime ministers of Netanyahu have on Jewish communities in these countries? I mean, are Jews always tied to Israeli policy and Israeli statements? Is that something that you consistently see happening?
Jews all over the world, or in most cases, support Israel as the homeland of the Jewish people. There is a very strong solidarity, connection between Jewish communities around the world and the State of Israel. Does that mean that they will support every single policy that Israel adopts? Or will they support every statement made by any Israeli politician? I mean, prime ministers or senior ministers? Not necessarily. They will not go publicly so far as to say, oh, he doesn't represent us, or she, They will find a way to open a distance if they find certain statements that they disagree with. If it affects their well-being, if it affects the country where they live, they will find a way of expressing,
But I guess it's just interesting that the Jewish communities would even have to speak to what Israel is choosing to do, right?
No, it's not a question whether they will speak. They will react if somebody asks them.
Right.
You see, in many places, people think that, especially in Latin America, you have to take into consideration that many people confuse. They use the word Israelitas, both as something for Jews and for Israelis.
Exactly.
And I remember many times I used to say, not all Israelis are Israelites, and not all Israelites are Israelis. And because there are many Israelis who are not Jews, and there are a lot of Jews who are not Israelis.
Thank you so much for coming in, Ambassador.
Thank you.
Well, reaction to U.S. President Donald Trump's executive order banning travelers from 7 Muslim countries from entering the United States has been quick to come, and particularly by many Jewish groups who are deeply troubled over its timing. The CEO of the Anti-Defamation League says it's a tragic irony the order was executed on the same day as International Holocaust Remembrance Day, and that the act is highly reminiscent of moves to keep European Jews out of America when they were being slaughtered by the Nazis. The ADL, which combats anti-Semitism and other forms of bigotry across the globe, is vowing to relentlessly fight the policy. The American Jewish Committee called the ban both unjust and unwarranted, and B'nai B'rith International called Trump's most sweeping use of his presidential power since taking office drastic. The Union of Reformed Jewry issued a blistering statement comparing the order to court decisions that upheld slavery in the Civil War and justified the internment of Japanese Americans during the 1940s. Meanwhile, hundreds of Jewish Americans who were refugees from the former Soviet Union are uniting in opposition and have signed a petition against the act. The White House says it's now going to form a more stringent screening process for travelers from Iran, Iraq, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, Syria, and Yemen, who are now forbidden to enter U.S. soil for at least 90 days. But it's important to note that the ban could also affect non-Muslims, including many Israeli Jews. One immigration attorney in New York told the Haaretz newspaper that his firm is advising their Israeli clientele, born in one of the blacklisted countries, not to risk traveling in or out of the U.S. right now, regardless of their faith or citizenship status. Sadly, the number of Jews who managed to survive the Holocaust is now dwindling as they advance in age, but several former inmates of Auschwitz death camp were able to make their way to Poland for this year's commemoration of International Remembrance Day. Those gathered in the camp listened to the testimonies of Jewish victims who say that to this day they still carry the wounds inflicted on them by Nazi Germany and its collaborators.
A w Izraelu lato jest długie i krótkie rękawy się nosi i ten numer był zawsze widoczny. To mnie dzieci pytały, a dlaczego masz napisane na ręku? Kto ci napisał? Pisze się przecież na papierze. No i wtedy musiałam coś powiedzieć, co to jest obóz koncentracyjny, wytłumaczyć prostymi słowami.
Another Auschwitz survivor brought to the death camp at the age of 12 says he had to undergo disinfection inside the very same building where the service was taking place.
Ja się nie czuję tutaj gościem honorowym. Ja tu się czuję zawsze byłym więźniem albo więźniem. Bo ja jak idę tym korytarzem wśród, tak jak teraz wchodziliśmy, to ja idę dalej goły. Tak jak wtedy, bo to jest w mojej pamięci. Nie tylko w mojej. To tak rozmawiam z koleżankami i kolegami z Birkenau. My wszyscy jesteśmy naznaczeni do śmierci prawdopodobnie tymi okropnymi przeżyciami.
Between 1940 and 1945, Nazi occupation forces gassed, shot, or hung more than 1 million people at the Auschwitz-Birkenau complex. Others died of neglect, starvation, or disease before the Soviet Red Army liberated the camp in 1945. The vast majority of the victims were Jewish and targeted simply for their faith. This year's remembrance ceremony comes as anti-Semitism is again on the rise in Europe, which is driving efforts to make certain the world never forgets the horror that can result from such persecution.
Spotykamy się tutaj w 72. już rocznicę wyzwolenia Kiel Auschwitz. Każdego roku odchodzą ostatni świadkowie tego przemysłowego morderstwa, jakie odbywało się właśnie tutaj. Z upływem czasu musimy zacząć myśleć, jak zachować pamięć o II wojnie światowej i o zagładzie.
That message particularly resonates in Poland because about half of the 6 million Jews who perished during the Second World War had been living there before their deaths. The European Parliament in Brussels held its annual commemoration remembering the 6 million Jews who perished in the Holocaust. This year, on International Holocaust Remembrance Day, the speakers noted with dismay that Europe is experiencing a troubling rise in anti-Semitism. ILTV's Steve Leibowitz was in Brussels and filed this report.
International Holocaust Remembrance Day was marked here in Brussels at the European Parliament. And while the memory of the 6 million Jews who perished at the hands of the Nazis was in everyone's mind, most of the speakers dealt with the issue of rising anti-Semitism here in Europe.
This act of remembrance takes place in a time when Europe is questioning itself, its future, and its values. A time when Europe is faced with multiple challenges, from unemployment to the refugee crisis, from migration to terrorism. But, unfortunately, antisemitism is not an issue of the past. Besides the horrendous attacks in Toulouse, Paris and Brussels against the Jewish communities in Europe, acts of violence are increasing.
Dr. Moshe Kantor, the president of the European Jewish Congress, was the driving force behind today's Remembrance Day at the European Parliament. And Moshe Kantor's message is also that while 6 million Jews perished in the Holocaust, there must be efforts made to prevent continuing anti-Semitism and crimes against humanity.
The Holocaust was a crime committed by Europeans. It was a crime against Europeans. And so, Europeans have a special responsibility to commemorate what their forefathers did or let happen. The European Union was created from the ashes of the war, a new Europe where Jews could live once again. And remarkably, Jews found a life in Europe again and have lived there for decades, even in Germany. We have built schools, we have joined armies, we have produced art masterpieces, we have made scientific discoveries. 2 generations of Jews grew up believing they had a home in Europe, like anyone else. But that is now changing.
We can never be complacent. Dr. Kantor reminded us earlier, these acts of anti-Semitism are here and now, even in Britain in the last few days. I'm ashamed to say there have been such acts perpetrated against the Jewish community. We are not complacent because we know the good that humanity can do. But we have also experienced the bad in too many places, in too many varied circumstances, against too many people, ever to be complacent. So vigilance is a necessity, and any sense of security is false.
Holocaust Remembrance Day 2017 in the shadow of rising anti-Semitism throughout Europe. This is Steve Leibowitz for ILTV, Brussels.
Now, here's some good news for at least 9% of Israel. Israel's now planning to join several U.S. states and European countries by decriminalizing personal marijuana use. The proposal comes from Israeli Public Security Minister Gilad Erdan, who's advocating that anyone caught smoking pot would be fined and not arrested or prosecuted, and that criminal procedures would be initiated only against repeat offenders.
אנחנו מציגים כאן הבוקר בשורה אמיתית ומדיניות חדשה ומקיפה, ומדובר בעצם במדיניות משולבת שמצד אחד היא לא מוותרת לגמרי על מרכיב האכיפה הפלילית, אבל מצד שני היא בהחלט מעבירה את מרכז המדיניות, את מרכז הכובד, לתחום של החינוך, ההסברה והטיפול.
Marijuana use is believed to be fairly popular in Israel, with the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime estimating that up to 9% of the population lights up once in a while. Apparently, the police have already relaxed their vigilance against the practice, and the latest data shows the enforcement against personal marijuana users has dropped by 30% since 2010. Only 188 people were arrested in 2015, reflecting a 56% drop from over 5 years ago. Erdogan's bill is likely to pass and go into effect within 3 months. Recreational use of the substance is now completely legal in 8 U.S. states and approved for medical research in 28. Israel's already a world leader in the field of medical cannabis, and about 10,000 residents have licenses to legally use the drug. That kind doesn't get you high, though. And now we think there are quite a few enthusiasts here in Israel already dusting off their Grateful Dead and Bob Marley albums in anticipation of a very happy springtime. Now here's the story of the day. The Israeli psychic Uri Geller has long been a celebrity, perhaps best known for his amazing ability to bend spoons and stop watches with the power of his mind. But now he's making headlines after receiving approval from a rather unexpected source, which you'll be surprised to find out is the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency. Proof the spy agency believes Geller indeed has paranormal abilities just surfaced in some of the 13 million pages of declassified CIA documents published online. One report details a week-long series of experiments the super secret agency conducted with Geller in 1973 at Stanford. Those experiments determined he demonstrated paranormal perceptual ability in a convincing and unambiguous manner. The tests were part of the U.S. military Stargate project investigating possible uses of psychic abilities. The 70-year-old Israeli unsurprisingly says that he knew it all along.
What the CIA has released now is just the tip of the iceberg. I have done quite a lot of experiments for them in different fields, like levitating a balance, a weight from an electronic scale, to locating minerals in metal cans. Incredible. And I was not only tested at Stanford, I also went through the Lawrence Livermore radiation labs where they'll build nuclear weapons. I think the task there was to see if my mind can, get a nuclear weapon going. Shocking.
In one spectacular experiment, Geller says he was able to partially replicate sketches being drawn by the testers at the same time, miles away.
They were looking at the drawing and they were transmitting it to me while I was sitting in the shielded room. And again, with a marker, I just drew what was coming into my inner mind. Some of them were very complicated. Some of them I got point on, like the bunch of grapes. They drew 24 grapes, I drew 24 grapes.
The CIA noted, though, that Geller didn't do as well in the presence of skeptics. But Geller says that any detractors who dismissed him as only being some sort of a trick performer were actually helping him to pull off a number of clandestine missions for several intelligence agencies during the Cold War era.
I didn't care. It was a good cover for me. The controversy, the skeptics kept me safe. It was an inbuilt safety device for me while I could secretly work for secret intelligence services. How I feel about it today, I look back at my career and the work and I say, hey, I did some amazingly fascinating things that brought in positive information that enhanced peace.
So he not only helped to establish world peace, but all the political pundits really should have asked the Israeli psychic about his prediction of several recent leadership elections that took most of them by surprise.
In September, on my Facebook, I wrote, whether you like him or not, Donald Trump is going to be the 45th President of the United States, and I was right. And when Theresa May, the Prime Minister of England, visited my home 2.5 years before she became the Prime Minister, I looked her in the eye like this. I held up a spoon that belonged to Winston Churchill and I said, Theresa, you're going to be the Prime Minister of England. She smiled. She said, no way. And I was right.
And now for our Hebrew word of the day. Ever wished you had psychic abilities? Well, they could certainly come in handy, so today's word is medium, meaning psychic in Hebrew. Now, this was an interesting word to research because, unsurprisingly, the word doesn't exactly exist in Hebrew. You can say medium, psichi, or nafshi mentali, but each of these words kind of refers to a crazy person. In other words, Israelis are so obsessed with what they believe to be reality that a medium is literally viewed as someone who's out of their mind. Well, the Hebrew language may suggest that, but maybe it's time for Israel to be a little more open-minded. After all, it's important to listen to your intuition because sometimes it may tell you everything you need to know. If you follow your imagination, you can control the future. And if that's not enough of a pep talk, just take a long look at the famous Israeli medium Uri Geller. He allegedly has the power to control objects with his mind, and the CIA just released a report claiming his paranormal abilities are in fact real. Let's go ahead and take a look at the weather forecast.
ILTV's weather forecast is sponsored by Adopt a Savta, taking care of Israel's lonely Holocaust survivors.
It's the beginning of a new week in the Holy Land, and luckily the rain has cleared after a stormy weekend. Monday should be partly cloudy with a high of 59 degrees Fahrenheit or 15 degrees Celsius. The rain should be back out by Tuesday evening, but the temperature should stay the same. All right, that's it for today's news. Today's exchange rate is 3.77 shekels to the American dollar. Remember to sign up for our daily newsletter at iltv.tv. Thanks for watching and see you tonight.